Have you ever talked about alcohol with someone who just fundamentally could not apprehend, could not sympathize with, could not relate to your reason for sobriety? The last time I had a conversation like this, it was with a Spanish guy born and raised in Spain. Spanish is a first language. And I wasn't preaching. I was sitting around with a whole kind of circle of tourists. We were all kind of chit-chatting as equals. It was one of the nice things about living in Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. Had some face-to-face discussions that kind of those days that, I don't know, now that the internet has devoured the real world, maybe it's become scarce. And I remember, he asked me for whatever reason, he said, "Oh, when did you stop drinking?" I think he might have asked just because he noticed I was the only person at the table who wasn't drinking alcohol. And I said, "Look, man, my days of drinking alcohol is like 16, 17, 18, basically my whole adult life. I haven't drank alcohol." And his whole way of responding to that, he had this deep-seated conviction that alcohol is good. Being drunk all the time is good, or enjoying being tipsy as often as possible is good. And the only possible reason, the only possible explanation for why I'm refusing to drink alcohol now is that I enjoy it too much and that I can't let myself drink alcohol, right? And, I wasn't preaching to this guy. It's just one of those funny things that happens in life. Frankly, I think if I were a less intimidating person, people would try to push me around and get me to drink alcohol more often. You know what I mean? And it's like, how can I communicate to you that I do not perceive alcohol as delicious? I do not perceive drinking alcohol as enjoyable. I do not perceive that altered state of mind as something I yearn for or something I can barely restrain myself from indulging in to excess. What you describe as the most desirable thing in your day, in your week, in your month, in your vacation, because we're having this conversation while he was on vacation and he was getting drunk every day. That is as appealing to me as a pile of shit seasoned with human vomit. It's actually disgusting to me. It's actually repugnant. What you enjoy drinking is something I hate, in the same way that you might refuse to drink camel urine. Not that you have anything against camels. And, most people in your life, they will just never get it. They will just never be able to examine the extent to which the things they find desirable are, from another person's perspective, repugnant. And it's for real reasons. There are really substantive, meaningful reasons why what you find delicious, delightful, entertaining, rewarding about drinking alcohol and the drunkenness that ensues, why it is that I find that repugnant. Some of you might have had that experience with a grandmother, someone like that. Maybe when you go to Christmas dinner, oh, come now, have a drink. Oh, join in the singing, join in the dancing. And, you're not going to preach to your own grandmother, or maybe you're only going to preach to her a little bit. You got some brothers. You're not going to tell your grandmother, no, grandma, this thing that's been giving you brain damage your whole life, this thing that's been giving you liver damage, and maybe this thing that actually put several of your blood relatives into the hospital, into an early grave. Oh yeah, I actually hate and despise that. And I kind of look down my nose at you because you haven't figured it out. Yeah, grandma. Yeah, you know what? Actually, I have contempt for this drug habit you've got. And I kind of have contempt for you as a drug addict. Well, no, you're probably not going to explain it to your grandmother that way. And I've been to family events where various people were in various stages of mourning for people whose lives had been ended by alcohol, whether that was the combination of alcohol and driving a car or just direct death, caused by alcohol. You have a sort of cultural discourse that's based on the presumption that something is desirable. And then we're just going to debate the extent to which we will discipline ourselves to minimize how much of it we're going to indulge in, or we're going to be moderate. We're going to moderate our indulgence, right? And I'm radically overturning that by really saying, no, what's desirable to you is repugnant to me. I don't have to discipline myself. I don't have to limit myself, right? I'm revolted by what you desire. So I got an email from a longtime viewer of the channel. And this guy, I think he's been watching my videos for 5 years, maybe more. He's been writing to me, asking for advice for many years, sometimes practical advice, specific decisions he's making in his own life, sometimes more profound general advice. And in this video, a lot of aspects of my philosophy that have come up in passing, things I've commented on obliquely and sometimes even implicitly, will here instead be made tremendously blunt and direct. And a lot of kind of little fragments will be brought together into one corpus. And if you've never seen the channel before, you don't need any of that background from years gone by. But the reason I mentioned that this guy watched so many of my videos over so many years is that I wonder if, in writing to me this way, I wonder if he knows, on a gut level, if there's some level of which he knows what I'm going to say to him, or if he has no idea. Maybe he won't see this video coming, so to speak. And he's writing me about issues that have come up amongst my viewers again and again. And I say that with no contempt for any of you. I think there's a reason why the type of person who wrestles with these issues would be watching my channel and donating to support me on Patreon and asking me these kinds of questions. Okay. So I'm going to start in the middle of the email, and I'll go back and read the part of the beginning in just a moment. It's not too long, an email. But he says that he worries about unnecessary spending on activities such as eating out in restaurants and buying fancy clothes. I've made so many videos talking for so many hours. Do I ever use that kind of terminology, that kind of verbiage? Do I talk about necessary and unnecessary? You might not have noticed that, or you might have picked out that sometimes I really do target these kinds of claims. The same way I talk about the distinction between natural and unnatural and good and evil. What's necessary and unnecessary? That's a decision made up in your own mind, right? There is no definition of what's necessary. You can survive on nothing but white rice, yellow lentils, and a vitamin pill every day. Take a multivitamin pill, white rice, yellow lentils. Your total food cost will be about $300 per annum. What is necessary? I would never talk about eating in a restaurant this way in terms of a decision made about necessity. And I'm just pointing out there's something implicit there, right? And now I'm wondering, why is he writing to me about this? What is it he's wanting to hear from me? Or maybe what is it that he's kind of apprehensive about? You know what I mean? Like maybe he's worried about what I'm going to tell him about this. Maybe he's writing to me and he's worried I'm going to tell him to stop making excuses and never eat out in a restaurant again in his life. No, I'm not. It's not how I respond, right? So he says he's worried about unnecessary spending, such as eating out in restaurants and buying fancy clothes. He asks, how can he reconcile using money in this sort of unnecessary way when so many people in the world have so little? Okay, so look, it's a sincere, well-intended question. You know what I mean? But the most fundamental part of my answer, there's more to talk about in this email. I don't want to go skiing, right? It's not something I want to do with my money. It's not something I want to do with my time. I don't have to, I don't have to restrain myself, prevent myself from going skiing. I don't want to go gambling at a casino. When I was in Las Vegas, Nevada with my girlfriend, we were basically there to save money on airplane tickets. This is a long story short. I found it really kind of emotionally upsetting and disturbing to walk through the casinos and see the reality of what was going on there, just to witness it for a few moments. We walked through pretty quick, but we did walk through the gambling halls of several of these casinos. Okay. I'm not restraining myself. I'm not disciplining myself. I'm not minimizing my indulgence, and I'm not seeking out a moderate path. And I'm not questioning, to what extent is it necessary for me to go gambling or go skiing to indulge in this way? I'm not counterposing that to the fate of the poor people of the world, as if by gambling or by going skiing, I'm actually stealing something from someone else, that I'm depriving someone else of a meal so that I can go gambling or go skiing, right? I actually hate gambling. And I hate many other things about the casino. You guys know I'm not a conventional feminist, but I am an unconventional feminist. I find the treatment of women in those casinos denigrating and disturbing. The half-naked women who are in all kinds of peculiar jobs in and around the casinos and promoting events in Las Vegas. And by the way, you can see my videos. I have a very nuanced position on pornography and prostitution and all these things. I'm not some simplistic sex negative person, but there are a lot of things aside from the gambling I find immoral and disturbing about the casinos. Okay. I actively reject, I actively repudiate gambling. I actively repudiate skiing. All right. To me, this is a shit pizza. All right. Now, I don't know when I will next go back to France. I don't know. A huge percentage of all the money I earned in the last 10 years was spent visiting my daughter in France. And it's possible this will happen again within the next year, within the next 2 years. Maybe not for another 5 years. We don't know. I'm employing a lawyer right now. You want to talk about necessary? You want to talk about necessary versus unnecessary? How is this even a meaningful term to apply? You see why I don't reason things through this way. Is it a necessary expense for me to fly? Before, initially it was to fly from China to Paris and then take a train from Paris to the Côte d'Azur to spend just a few days with my daughter. Is that necessary? An unbelievable amount of money. If you add up all 4 trips, just the trains and planes and so on, right? You know what? I suggested to my mother that the next time we go to France, or at some point in the future, we go to a unique museum that exists in France that's devoted to the history of the French Revolution. Okay? I know a lot about the French Revolution, that particular history. I don't know if this could be combined with visiting my daughter or not. I don't know. Okay. I'm using this museum rather than some of the examples you've heard on my channel before. I sometimes talk about going to visit the pyramids, or I don't know if you want to go visit some ancient Buddhist temple, or I don't know, some. Okay, but this is a very explicitly educational experience. It's a museum in France dedicated to the history of the French Revolution. And I actually went there with my mother when I was almost a toddler. I could walk, but barely. I was a little tight. And I have memories from that trip, even though I was so young. I don't think I'd started kindergarten yet. I mean, we could figure out exactly what year that was. When I was a little tiny kid, I went there. So it's something meaningful, linking me to my mother and linking me to my childhood and the history and political philosophy of the French Revolution. So that's been with me my whole life. Is it necessary for me to go and see that museum and see it with my mother and learn something? And, partly I'll learn something new, but obviously going to the museum, mostly I will be rehearsing knowledge I've already learned. I've already read a lot about the history of the French Revolution, but, probably reinforcing and illustrating things I know, adding detail to things I know. Nobody's even going to question it because we're not talking about something evil, right? We only think in this way about moderation and necessity when we're talking about a necessary evil. We're talking about a moderate amount of evil, moderate drinking of alcohol, moderate brain damage, moderate gambling, right? That's what the discourse is implicitly about. Like on a deep level, I feel like there's an asymmetry between the two sides here. That's the same as that asymmetry I described to myself and the Spanish guy who I met. This was actually in northwestern Laos, in the middle of nowhere, sitting around talking with these tourists. Where it's like, I don't think I can get you to understand what alcohol means to me, and it doesn't mean to me what it means to you, right? And the strange sense of meaninglessness of necessity. Buying a book isn't necessary. Reading a book isn't necessary, right? Why would necessity be the criterion we hold up to any of these questions? What we're talking about is good and evil, right? Is it good to go gambling in Las Vegas, Nevada? Is it good to spend a moderate amount of money gambling in Las Vegas, Nevada? I believe the answer to that question is in no way reciprocal with the question of whether or not you would take the money and give it to a charity to feed starving people if you did not go gambling. Like the question of whether gambling or skiing or drinking alcohol is a good use of your time and money, that has to be settled in and of itself. You have to take up your own position. You have to come up with your own conclusions on that. And it is neither going to be justified nor condemned, because hypothetically, the money that could be spent gambling, could be spent drinking alcohol, could be spent eating in fancy restaurants, that instead that hypothetically could feed a poor, starving person, right? We're making judgments about good and evil. And as I've said in numerous videos from numerous angles, the ultimate question is of what kind of person you want to become, right? Now, it's very painful, but yeah, I was deeply committed to wanting to be, a meaningful part of my own daughter's life. I spent so much money. There was one trip where I only saw her for, I think, 2 hours. Maybe it was 1 hour. I flew from Canada to Germany. I saw her. There's a video of it. I honestly forget if it was 1 hour or 2 hours. This very short visit that I crossed the ocean for. I spent all the money I had in the world. And at that time, I had very, very little money in my name. You're making this enormous sacrifice, and you don't even know if this kid is going to remember it. You know what I mean? Okay, that's who I want to be. I want to do the right thing just because it's the right thing to do. And by the way, in making that trip, my ex-wife lied to me and attempted to blackmail me, and she lied to me and said she was going to report me to the police. And I actually went to the police station. She didn't. I mean, she said she reported me to the police, and I went and talked to the police, and it wasn't true. There was all this, unbelievable drama. And what she was trying to blackmail me into, she wanted me to sign paperwork giving up the right to spend time with my own daughter. I was like, blackmail doesn't work this way. You can't force me to sign a paper giving up exactly the thing I want to get. Like, you have to give up one thing in order to get another thing. It can't be that you promise me that you'll let me see my daughter if I sign this paper giving up my legal right to see my daughter. Blackmail doesn't work that way. Really nasty, terrible situation. Okay. All right. But you know what? We get into a lot of other more difficult questions about good and evil, good and bad, and what kind of person you want to become. Was it necessary for me to go to Cambodia? Was it necessary for me to go to Laos? No, there's no necessity. And what are you going to say? The money I spent on an airplane ticket for me to go to Cambodia and pursue humanitarian work and try to make the world a better place, humanitarian work, research, learning languages, all this stuff. Oh, well, in theory, that could have provided so many sacks of rice for so many starving people. No, there are questions here of good and evil. And if you are doing something good, you actually positively think it's good, these questions wouldn't even arise in your mind's eye, right? You say, oh yeah, no, this is something really meaningful and positive I want to do in Cambodia, and it's good for me. Like, I'm going to become a better person. Cambodia is going to become a better place. The world's going to become a better place, et cetera, et cetera. And then, there are pragmatic costs. There are pragmatic questions of to what extent the cost can be justified by how much good you're gonna get out of it, right? So you already have a hint that you're asking the wrong questions, or you're evaluating the problem in the wrong way when you're thinking in terms of moderation and minimization. Because whatever you're talking about moderating, whatever you're talking about minimizing is evil. Okay. And on a deeper level, we're about to hear it, just the next paragraph in this email. His assumption is that whatever you are doing with your money kind of exists in the shadow of this potential you have to give away your money to charity. And the charity is going to do something with that money far better than anything you could do for yourself or others. And that is a delusion. And it's one, I think, my whole philosophy has been perhaps too subtly set against so far on this YouTube channel. I do see your questions coming in, guys, but as you can see, I am trying to answer this question from supporter on Patreon. If you have a second, hit the thumbs up button. It'll help more people discover the stream while this is still ongoing. Yes, there's a question of what does Eisel think of marijuana, and several people in the audience already know. I just say, you can look up the list of my videos in the past. You just hit Control F on your keyboard, hit Find on your keyboard, and you can look at the different videos I've made specifically about marijuana. Obviously, that's an example of a keyword that's very, very easy to search for in that list. Some other topics, it's a bit more nuanced because there's more than one way to say it, or what have you. Okay, so he says that when he looked up this issue on the internet, all the results were people talking about their anxiety over their personal poverty. Whereas, I might add, his anxiety seems to be about his personal wealth, going to fancy restaurants and buying fancy clothes, apparently. He says, this is, of course, a thought experiment, but I still ponder on it myself, even though I will continue to eat out at fancy restaurants and buy fancy clothes. Period. Moderation is perhaps the way. Setting aside a moderate amount for charity is good, and buying some nice stuff is too, period. So I really just wonder, why is he saying this to me? I think if he said the same thing to his mother, to his father, to his work colleagues, to friends, there are such a huge percentage of people you would say this to would just unthinkingly nod and agree with you in our culture or in our century. But I wonder if on some level he apprehends or anticipates that I am that incredibly rare person who is going to disagree with him root and branch. I'm going to reject this quite fundamentally. All right. Now, I just point out, in a subtle way, you may not have noticed this on my channel, I have been constantly undermining this concept of charity. I have been constantly challenging it. I have been constantly invalidating it. I talk a lot about charity. I talk a lot about charity work. I talk a lot about the aspiration to make the world a better place. I talk about the way in which personal altruism can be educational for the altruist, that you can gain a lot, you can learn a lot by going out and making the world a better place. And I've contrasted charity of this kind, of a very hands-on, personally involved charity, to the unbelievable lives of passivity and self-indulgence of many of my fellow YouTubers who are addicted to video games and what have you. But have you ever once heard me say, hey guys, giving money to this charity is a great idea? There have been so many different charities analyzed on this channel, including charities that claim to represent causes or that actually do represent causes that I sympathize with. Vegan charities. We went through a detailed discussion of quite a few different vegan charities, asked the question, where does your money go? What difference does it make? I have never once said to you, donating money to this charity is a good idea. Okay. You can remember also my repeated discussions of the Black Lives Matter movement. I've heard a lot of people just this week saying that they're so glad they never gave money to Black Lives Matter. I've been listening to the latest round of kind of recrimination and analysis of where did the money go, $90 million. Why is there so little to show for it? Why did some of the leaders of the movement become wealthy and so little was accomplished in so many years, so many millions of dollars? And I've heard a bunch of different Black Americans saying they're so glad they never gave a dime to this organization, Black Lives Matter. I've never heard anyone say that they regret that they missed the opportunity to donate money. Gee, I sure wish my $5,000 were added onto that pile of millions of dollars that have in this way disappeared. So, I've offered you guys a critique of charity again and again and again from many different angles. You have never heard me once say anything like what he's saying here, quote, setting aside a moderate amount of your income for charity is good. Okay. I have never said charity is good, as ridiculous as, and I never would say anything like that. I've challenged you again and again to think about what charity really means. Now, some people are so mentally disabled that they can't help anyone, not even themselves. Okay. Some people are so totally lacking in their own judgment, their own ability to do research, their own ability to have initiative, that they have to pay someone else to go out and make the world a better place. Is that your situation? Really? Like, whatever the cause is we're talking about, you really think you should hand your money over to someone else who should go out and do that instead of you rolling up your sleeves to make that difference. And I've got to tell you something, I don't believe you. All right. Like, the fact that you're capable of writing this email to me means I don't believe you. Whatever this guy's situation is, I have no idea how much or how little money he has. Okay. Syria has been going on since 2011 or so, Syrian civil war. I'm not saying you can go every year. I'm not saying you can, devote your whole life to it, or, in the space of the last 10 years, you could have made 2 or 3 trips to Syria. You could have used your own money. You could have started your own foundation or your own agency. You could have, as one single individual, made a difference in people's lives with no intermediary organization, no bureaucracy, so on and so forth. It would have meant more to you. It would have meant more to the people you helped. What have you got? You got $5,000, $10,000, $50,000. How much have you got? However much or how little, even with an example as daunting as the Syrian civil war, all right, the difference you could make directly, it'll mean more to you, it'll mean more to others, and you'll stand to learn a great deal more, as opposed to taking that money, putting it in an envelope, and handing it to what's basically a faceless corporation, for want of a better term, handing it to a charity. And there, on my channel, again and again and again, there has been this critique of the charity sector, of the charity industry, of what's wrong with it. What's wrong with PETA? What's wrong with People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals? It's wrong with 99% of charities. Like, I'm tempted to just say it's 100% of charities. But there's a different criterion to bring to bear here. Even if there are 1% of charities that will make really excellent use of your money that aren't like PETA, what if, instead of comparing the charity to you wasting your money gambling or you wasting your money skiing, etc., what if instead we're comparing you paying someone else to do something virtuous to you doing it yourself? All right. What kind of belief do you have about yourself? You see what I'm saying here? What kind of belief do you lack, or what kind of belief do you, I don't know how to put it. What is your judgment on your own character? Are you such a worthless person? Are you such a stupid person? Are you such a weak person that you can't help anyone, that you can't make any difference in the world with your own 2 hands and apparently your thousands of dollars? Again, it's not going to be every day. It's not going to be every month. Maybe during the span of 10 years in Syria, or I don't know, however you want to, any given decade for any given conflict or any given crisis, maybe there are just 1 or 2 points at which you personally can get involved. But trust me, whether you went for 2 weeks or 2 months, you'd remember that for the rest of your life, and you might be able to help people that you would then have some kind of meaningful connection with for the rest of your life. And maybe not. Maybe you'd hate and resent all the people you worked with. Maybe you'd come back with a much darker view of human nature after having terrible experiences being in the charity industry, which I had myself. But at least that would be a learning experience that you did indeed have yourself. That would be something invaluable. You would have bought yourself something of great worth with your donations to charity in that sense. All right. Okay, so I think I'm now going to read this sort of from start to finish, so you'll see the context. So going back to the start of the email, he introduces himself. I remember him, blah, blah, blah. He then says, regarding human capacity, for example, one could live an intellectual life which has no impact on anyone else financially, which would limit their ability to have a positive impact on the world, but it would still be an enriching life, researching and writing research papers. How would one reconcile having this life, knowing that a high-paid job would include higher tax revenue for the country's benefit and a higher possibility of using your own money to do good in the world also? So that's the first part of his question before what I read you before. Okay? So do you know anyone who's ever had to make this decision? Do you know anyone who was working as a dentist and said to you, well, they earn a lot of money working as a dentist, but they really feel they're stifling their own ability to make the world a better place through what they could accomplish writing research papers, what they could accomplish as an intellectual? That's your example, is writing research papers. So that's why I'm sticking with that example. In your whole life, do you think you'll meet even one person for whom that's a choice, for whom that's a conflict? And even if you did meet that one person, if you met someone who told you that, do you think you would suspect that they're delusional? Like, this guy's a dentist and he has this delusion that he's a great intellectual who could really make a difference in the world through his research papers, through writing research. Okay? The value of that intellectual life for the tiny minority of people who have the option to live it is so extraordinary that nobody would trade it to work as a fucking dentist. And nobody would justify being a dentist because they would have the opportunity to pay a higher rate of taxes. Right? For the tiny, tiny minority of people who have that choice to make, right? Those are precisely the people who cannot be bought, who cannot be bribed, because they know the value of their unique intellectual potential, whether they think of that in terms of research, in terms of creative writing, whatever form of intellectual activity it is, could never be compared to this model you have of a life of drudgery, earning money, and donating to charity. Now, again, these delusions are linked and reciprocal. Your vision that earning money is meaningful is in this way linked to your deep-seated assumptions about charity as a positive part of your meaningful life. And what you're describing as charity, I see instead as a saddening, sickening judgment that you're passing on yourself. That you are someone who is so intellectually disabled that you have to hand that money over to someone else who can make those decisions for you, who can do that research for you, who can make that difference in the world for you. Now, sorry, I was using Syria off the top of my head as an example, and I talked about Cambodia. I alluded to Cambodia and Laos briefly, but you guys all know the vast majority of charity work, it's in your own country. You know, it's in your own language. There are opportunities all the time to make the world a better place, right? That rely on your initiative, your ingenuity, your intelligence, your honesty, your integrity, right? And you can even ask other people for donations. You can say, oh, yeah, you know, right now there's a hurricane, there's a disaster, and some people need help. And oh, yeah, so I've got a few $1,000. I'm going to go down in my truck. And you know what? If I need to buy some other stuff, I'm going to take photographs of how much it costs. I'll post the receipt on Instagram. And hey, if you 10 guys, if you guys can all throw in a couple $1,000, I can buy a few more tents and mattresses or whatever it is, right? There's a way for you to make a difference. And you know what? You might get ripped off. You might get swindled. You might get lied to. Big corporate charities do also, in case you didn't know. All the time, you just wouldn't learn anything from it. You wouldn't hear anything back about it, right? You know, you might try to help someone and, you know, you end up learning a harsh lesson about human nature instead, right? And the other thing that's interesting that's built into this question is you say, for example, one could live an intellectual life which has no impact on anyone else financially. I don't think anyone is measuring the value of their intellectual life in terms of its financial impact on others, right? If you are going to be the person who does research revealing that the water coming out of everyone's taps is poisonous, you don't measure the value of that research financially, right? Whether it's a book you publish, a research paper, whether it's, you know, there are all kinds of intellectual things people do that are either creative or destructive, either implicitly or explicitly political, some kind of attempt to change the world, to challenge yourself to grow, to challenge other people to grow, you know. You know, sorry, in a lot of these countries too, like the United States, one of the saddest kind of one of the most pathetic forms of charity, of course, is raising money for court cases. Okay, you want to go fight about the future of circumcision in the Supreme Court, you know, you want to put the money together and hire lawyers and dispute whether or not parents have the right to, you know, cut off part of a newborn infant's body, you know, and change its life forever, so on and so forth. You know, does anyone evaluate that in terms of its financial impact on others? Okay, so then caught up to where I was before in reading his question. He says, this is, of course, just a thought experiment, but he still ponders on it himself, even though he continues to eat out in fancy restaurants and buy fancy clothes. Moderation is perhaps the way. Setting aside a moderate amount for charity is good, and buying some nice stuff is too. If one wants to dedicate their life to study and education without much financial freedom, then it is an individual's right to pursue happiness and ignore the fact that they could do this or that. But I'm afraid to say this question over personal spending has been a prolonged thought that I'm not expecting to go away. My life has been in flux, as has everyone's, due to the conditions, the year 2020 and 2021, which is maybe why I think deeply about such things in between the fog and the desolation. So yeah, you can see this is a sincere, well-intentioned message, right? The above is the above is something only rich nations have to contend with although most people probably ignore such thoughts as much as possible as they see that capitalism is generally working. There's an incredible expansion of wealth across the world that people in former ages, like the Roman Empire, would never have dreamed of. And he says nobody even talks about the incredible progress in human welfare over the last 50 years or even the last 20 years. Many years ago on this channel, I talked about these issues from a very different perspective, from a very different point of view, because I had a lot of viewers on the channel. Now, 5 years ago, more than 5 years ago, I remember talking about it in the airport when I was leaving to go to Thailand from Victoria, Canada. I had a lot of viewers who were really attached to this notion of minimalism, where they saw themselves as subtracting from the planet's welfare, that anything they do, anything they eat, anything they buy, anything they own, anything they use is being stolen, being subtracted from some greater sum, SUM, of the world's welfare. That this was a harm they had to apologize for or had to justify. And what I try to point out again and again is, no, your life is something positive. Your ambitions, your aspirations are something positive that you don't have to justify. This sense of subtraction and of having to minimize the harm done only makes sense when we're talking about harm. It only makes sense when we're talking about something you're ashamed of. It only makes sense when we're talking about something bad and evil and wrong. Now, if you are going to Las Vegas to go gambling and drink alcohol and use drugs and sleep with prostitutes, I understand why you might take a harm reduction view of this. Say, well, you're going to try to minimize the amount of time you lose, minimize the amount of money you lose, why you might be minimizing something that you are ashamed of, why you might look at all of these habits, whether it's the alcohol, the gambling, the prostitution, or what have you, and say, oh, well, these are things you have to struggle to do in moderation, right? This is why I want to come back to the concept of charity, right? Nobody talks about charity in moderation. Nobody talks about charity as something you have to minimize, right? Nobody has ever said to me, don't you feel bad about the airplane fuel that was burned when you were flying to Cambodia to do a combination of humanitarian work and research? No, of course I don't feel bad. Now, I said this many years ago, say it very briefly now. Maybe you've heard that. Maybe this is familiar to some of you if you heard it all those years ago on my YouTube channel. If you believe that a war is worth fighting and a war is worth winning, you would not trouble yourself about how much gasoline is being burned, being wasted, being used up in order to transport soldiers across the ocean to fight that war. It's precisely when the war is something you're ashamed of, something evil, something you're morally opposed to, that you then talk in this way about minimizing or moderating the impacts or the waste, caused by the war. If you believe that the United States of America should put 110% of its effort into defeating the Nazis in Germany, whatever example you want to use, of course you would see the burning of fossil fuels, the use of jet fuel, of airplanes, as justified for that purpose toward that end. It would just seem laughably ridiculous to question, in the sense, the efficiency of the war or how to minimize the war. It would be ridiculous to say, well, couldn't we save a lot of jet fuel if we fought the war half as hard for twice as many years? This is a notion of efficiency that's irrelevant to war, and it's irrelevant to charity. It's irrelevant to anything you're undertaking. So when I look at these kinds of questions, what I see is a complex struggle of someone who doesn't want to face up to the extent to which really what they're doing is making judgments about good and evil, right? So now we have a four-way grid. There are things that are good that I perceive as good and I feel good about. There are things that are evil that I perceive as evil and I therefore find repulsive and repellent and I'm not tempted by, right? So for me, that's alcohol. We said at the start of this video, I don't yearn for alcohol. I don't restrain myself. I don't discipline myself. I don't moderate it. I perceive alcohol as something bad, and therefore I want absolutely none of it in my life, right? I just don't want it to be a part of my life in any way, okay? There are things that are good, but I have to admit to myself, I can't perceive them as good. I can't feel good about them. I can't feel positively motivated to do them. And that's complicated. Okay. And then there are things that are bad, and I know them to be bad. I know them to be evil, but I can't perceive them to be bad. I can't perceive them to be evil. I can't feel repulsed by them. I can't feel revolted by them, right? I still feel drawn to them. You still feel tempted. You still feel this is something, for whatever reason, you want to do, okay? These judgments will absolutely never be based on the notion that you could substitute one thing for another, right? Because moral judgments aren't substitutable, right? I don't want to gross you guys out with examples. There are circumstances in which you may make the decision that you will refuse to do an evil act, knowing full well that another man will do that act instead of you, after you, next to you. And many people will look at that and say, well, you might as well do it anyway. No, because one man can't be substituted for another man. One decision can't be substituted for another decision, not when it's questions of right and wrong. All right. If you have made the decision, and by the same token, you're never going to be able to minimize something good or something bad. You can't exaggerate the good or minimize the bad. You can't change the significance or scale of these things by pointing out what you could have done with the same time, what you could have done with the same money. Anyway, ethical decisions are only and always directed towards things that are actual, not hypothetical. Okay. So look, if you want to write a book, these are questions we really deal with in our real lives. Okay. You may be a parent who is looking at the reality of the fact that you will neglect your own son, you will neglect your own daughter if you take the time to write a book, and you have to make a hard choice. Is it worth it? Now, I've got to tell you something. If I was in a situation where I were raising my own daughter, I know my own values, I wouldn't be writing this book. The book I'm writing right now is 100% a product of the French legal system, the slowness of the French divorce courts, et cetera, et cetera. You know what I'm saying? But, I do understand that. I mean, he was talking here about a research project. I do understand there are some people who are working on the cure for cancer or whatever it is, and they say, okay, there's something positive about raising my own child, and there's something about writing this book, getting this research done, so on and so forth. Where they feel committed to pursuing that outcome. But wouldn't it be ridiculous to try to judge the value of that book by comparing it to the neglected role of parenting? How much it would have mattered, how much it would have meant for the writer to instead spend time raising his own son, raising his own daughter, or vice versa. To judge your own child, to judge the value of the parenting you've done, saying, just think of the book I could have written. All right. Now, people do torment themselves with these notions. They do. I think people drive themselves insane with them. But these are really, strictly speaking, in principle, insane. Okay. There are different reasons for eating in a fancy restaurant. I don't know yours. I don't know. Okay. Some men eat in a fancy restaurant in order to impress a woman, or they eat in a fancy restaurant, for all kinds of frankly cruel and venal reasons. I know it's going to sound ridiculous. There are bad reasons to eat in fancy restaurants. You know what I mean? This could be something that in your case, it's really quite dark. And it could be, I mean, one of the times I eat in restaurants is when I'm in airports. It could be, look, if I'm going to make this journey, I've got to go find the vegan option and eat in these restaurants. I've got to scrape by this way. I just bought a bunch of vegan power bars because I was assuming I was going to classes on a university campus. Didn't work out. I've got to make those decisions where it's like, I can't eat a proper meal. I've got to do this for that reason. Is it worth it? You've got to make those decisions. But I think, if you really thought it was bad to eat in this restaurant, you wouldn't enjoy it any more than I would enjoy drinking alcohol or I would enjoy gambling. If you really think this is bad and evil and wrong, don't kid yourself. You would find this repugnant. And there's all kinds of self-indulgence. There's all kinds of, wastes of time and wastes of money that I do find repugnant, that I do find repellent. So again, most people don't think skiing is a big deal. I really do. You know what I mean? I don't think it's suitable for an adult to spend their time or money or energy even going skiing. Even that I'm willing to look down my nose at. You know what I mean? I think that very simply, this complexity you've brought to this question and you're struggling and why it is you're writing to me, asking for an answer, it's all going to disappear if you can just admit to yourself what the role of good and evil is in these decisions that you're making. If you think that it is good to be a dentist, to become a dentist and earn a lot of money and have no time and maybe snuff out your intellectual potential, vaguely alluded to here, to do something more positive in the world. If you really think that's good, you wouldn't be asking me this question. And on the other hand, if you really thought you had the potential to make a difference in this world intellectually, if you thought that you had the potential to make a difference in this world through charity of any kind, charity with your own hands, with your own intelligence, with your own ingenuity, with your own initiative, you wouldn't be asking me this question. The reality is that you're asking me this question because you're not living a life that's devoted to any kind of intellectual activity. You're not living a life that's devoted to any kind of charity. You're not living a life that you believe is making the world a better place or that's making you a better person. You behold yourself as someone who's spending all of your time and money, or too much of your time and money, on fancy clothes and fancy restaurants. And you're asking yourself, how was it that with these seemingly good intentions, it all could have gone so terribly wrong? I'm not entirely